作顺利。
This is Roger Dawson. Welcome back to the 7th in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last session, I taught you how to analyze your personality style and the personality style of your buyers. Then I taught you how to adapt your negotiating style to the personality style of the buyer to whom you're selling. That's powerful stuff, and I hope that you've been getting a lot of good use out of it. This session will be a lot of fun because we're going to talk about something that's becoming very important in our rapidly changing business environment: how to negotiate with foreigners. Since I'm an immigrant, I came here from England when I was 22, I'm very conscious of the enormous ethnic diversity in this great country. So even if you don't sell directly to foreign buyers, the chances are good that it won't be long before you will. So I'll teach you the way that Americans negotiate is very different from the way that other nationalities negotiate. Then in the second half of today's session, I'll teach you how to analyze the force that's driving the other side in a negotiation. Knowing that is the key to win-win negotiation. First, negotiating with foreigners. At my Secrets of Power negotiating seminars, I usually get some questions about negotiating with foreigners. It seems that just about everybody has had a frustrating experience dealing either with a foreigner in a foreign country or a person of foreign origin who lives in this country. I'm an immigrant from England, and although I've been here over 30 years and a citizen for over 20 years, I can relate to the difficulty of dealing with foreigners. Along with my experience of moving here and adapting to the American way of doing things, I've traveled also to 94 other countries around the world. It's easy for foreigners to misunderstand us. Because of my background, I know how different America is from any other country on earth, and how America is deceptively different to foreigners. They think they know us from watching our movies and television shows. However, movies and television shows don't always reveal what is in the American heart and mind, and that is what determines our approach to business. Conversely, we tend to look at foreigners and think we understand them. True, they may dress in Western business suits and speak our language, but that doesn't mean that their traditional values and mindsets have changed. They may prefer American music and American movies, but their beliefs in their way of life and the values they place on their traditions are as strong as ever. I believe that underneath all of our apparent similarities, there are enormous differences in our approach to business. So let's take some time and try and unravel the mysteries of negotiating with foreigners. New York real estate investor Donald Trump wrote a best-selling book called The Art of the Deal that detailed many of his remarkable real estate negotiations. The title and premise of the book illustrate what is the overriding concern of most American negotiators: the cutting of the deal. We do live in a very deal-conscious environment. And I suppose that sociologists would tell you that this is because we're such a mobile and diverse society that we have little sense of roots. Instead of trusting people in the way things are done, as is common around the world, we place all of our trust in creating an unbreakable deal. Will it hold up in court, we demand, as though anyone who doesn't consider the possibility of having to defend the deal in court is naive. Most foreigners completely reject our dependence on the deal. Should they choose to sign a contract at all, it is simply an expression of an understanding that existed between the parties on a particular date. It is a formal expression of a relationship that now exists between the parties. As with any other relationship, it must mold itself to changing conditions. It astounds most Americans to learn that you can sign a contract in Korea and have it mean nothing 6 months later. But we signed a contract, the American howls. Yes, their Korean counterpart patiently explains. We signed a contract based on the conditions that existed 6 months ago when we signed it. Those conditions no longer exist, so the contract we signed is meaningless. Foul, cries the American. You're trying to cheat me. Not at all. What seems to be disreputable action to us is not to them, and we should not interpret it that way. It is merely their way of doing things. It often delights Americans who are selling to people from the Middle East that they had so little trouble getting a contract signed. Then they are horrified to find out that in the Arab world, signing a contract announces the start of the negotiations, not the end. A signed contract means less in their culture than a letter of intent does in ours. I'm not putting this down, and you shouldn't either. What you should do is recognize that different nationalities and cultures have different ways of doing things. And if you plan to sell to them, it behooves you to learn, understand, and appreciate those ways. It won't surprise you to learn that Americans resort to legal action more quickly and frequently than any other people on earth. This would be laughable to a salesperson in many countries such as India, where the civil legal system is close to non-existent. Before you put too much dependence on that contract you signed with a foreign buyer, perhaps you should figure out how you could ever force them to adhere to it. Even if you're selling in a country that does have an operative legal system for civil lawsuits, the damage it could do you might mean it's not worth pursuing. In America, legal action is so common that companies continue to do business with a company that is suing them. We see it as a normal way to resolve a dispute and no reason for rancor. In most foreign countries, there is such a loss of face involved in being sued that they will refuse to deal with you in any way once you've sued them. Apart from concentrating more on the deal and on the relationship between the parties, the other major mistake that we Americans make in dealing with foreigners is that we want to get down to business too quickly. Nobody gets down to business faster than Americans do. Typically, we exchange a few pleasantries to ease any tension and then get right down to hammering out the details of the deal. We socialize afterwards. Foreigners may take days, weeks, or even months before they feel comfortable moving from the getting to know you stage to the point where they feel good about doing business with you. When the Shah of Iran fell from power, the real estate company that I ran in Southern California did a huge amount of business with Persians who were fleeing the new regime in Iran, often with millions in cash to invest. Often I would watch our people make the mistake of trying to talk business too soon, which caused the Iranians to distrust them. Quickly we learned that they needed time to size us up and wanted to sit and drink tea for several hours before talking business. If you fly to Japan to conduct business, you may have to socialize for many days before they feel that it's appropriate to talk business. Now be careful, however, that they're not just trying to push you up against a time deadline. At my seminars, many people have told me that their joy at being treated so well soon turned to chagrin as they realized how difficult it would be to get down to business at all. They have told me horror stories of not being able to negotiate until they were in the limousine on the way back to the airport. True, it's a 2-hour ride out to Narita Airport, but that's negotiating under excessive time pressure. Terrified at the thought of going home empty-handed, they went straight to their bottom line. So you're likely to fall into two major traps when selling to foreigners. You will overemphasize the deal and not attach enough importance to the relationship of the parties, and you'll get down to business too quickly. The two are closely related, of course. Building a relationship with a foreign buyer to the point where you feel comfortable with him takes time. Enlarging on that relationship to the point where you trust him and he trusts you so that you don't have to rely on the contract being airtight takes a great deal of time. Let's take a look at 9 characteristics of the typical American who sells to foreigners. Of course, this may not describe you accurately, but if you identify with any of these characteristics, you should adapt your approach when selling to foreigners. 1. To a foreigner, you are probably very direct in your communications. You use expressions such as, "What's your bottom line?" or "How much profit would you make at that figure?" Or you try to shift the emphasis of the negotiations by saying, "Let's lay our cards on the table," or "Let's wrap this one up tonight." While this kind of directness puts pressure on the other side, realize that to foreigners it may seem too blunt, and such bluntness will probably offend them. 2. Because you're an American, you probably resist making outrageous initial demands. This goes back to your hope that you can cut the deal and get out of Dodge. Because you want to blitz the negotiations and wrap them up quickly, you tend to think in much shorter time frames than do foreigners. You're thinking you can conclude the negotiations in hours, while they're thinking it will take many days. While a foreigner may make outrageous initial demands because he knows that the price and terms will change enormously as days go by, you see that as slowing the negotiations down by drawing you both into endless haggling. 3, you're more likely to negotiate alone than a foreigner. It's not unusual to find a lone American negotiator showing up at an international negotiation, fully empowered to do business. You may be able to put together a team of 3 if it includes your interpreter and driver. Then when you get to the negotiating room, you find a team of 10 or 12 negotiators from the other side. Of course, this is not good for you because you'll feel psychologically overwhelmed unless the negotiating teams are roughly the same size. However, the effect of this on the foreign team concerns me more. They see a lone negotiator and they may interpret this as they're not serious about making a deal at this meeting because they've only sent one negotiator. This must only be a preliminary expedition. Or they get the impression that you're merely gathering information to take back to your team of negotiators. Unless you understand this and take pains to explain that you are the entire negotiating team and that you are empowered, up to a point, to negotiate the deal, they may not take you seriously. 4, you're probably uncomfortable with emotional displays. The English are the worst, of course, but Americans also see displaying emotions in public as a weakness. If your wife starts to cry, for example, you probably assume that you have done something devastatingly cruel to her. In the Mediterranean countries, the husband would simply wonder what ploy his wife had concocted. If you fear an emotional reaction, you'll be tentative in your sales to foreigners. And if the buyer does explode with anger at one of your proposals, you tend to overreact. Instead, you should merely see it as a negotiating ploy that might be perfectly acceptable in their culture. 5, you tend to expect short-term profits. Beside wanting to conclude the negotiations before you build a relationship with the other side, you also expect quick results from the deal that you cut. Realize that you look at quarterly dividends, whereas foreign investors are looking at 10-year plans. To many foreigners, this comes across, unfairly I think, as a fast buck mentality. Where they are looking to build a long-term relationship with us, you appear to concentrate only on profits, and this can be offensive to them. 6, you're less likely to speak a foreign language. There's no question that English is becoming the business language of the world. Conferences in Europe are typically conducted in English these days because it is the common denominator language. Most European business people can speak 2 foreign languages and one of them is always English. Most Oriental business people can at least understand English, even if they cannot speak it well. Sadly, hardly any Americans can speak German or Japanese. If you do know a foreign language, it's probably Spanish or French. To realize how arrogant this may appear to foreigners, you only have to think of how frustrated you became when you first dined in a Parisian restaurant. When the waiter didn't appear to speak any English, you probably thought as I did. This is a tourist restaurant. They must get English-speaking people in here all the time. Why is he being so difficult by refusing to speak English? Unfortunately, this attitude is all too prevalent with American business people. Any expectation that if they want to do business with us, they should learn our language can come across as irritatingly arrogant to a foreigner. Instead, you should always appear surprised and delighted that they can speak even a few words of our language. You should always make an effort to speak a few words of their language, even if it's only to say good morning and thank you. 7, you're probably uncomfortable with silence. 15 seconds of silence seems like an eternity to you. Do you remember the last time the sound went out on your television? You were probably up thumping the top of the set within 15 seconds. Particularly to Asians who are comfortable with long periods of meditation, this impatience appears to be a weakness, and a weakness that they can exploit. When dealing with foreigners, don't be intimidated by long periods of silence. Instead, see it as a challenge to not be the next one to talk. After an extended period of silence, the next person to talk loses. The next person to open their mouth will make a concession. 8, you hate to admit that you don't know. As I'll tell you in our next session when we talk about the importance of gathering information, you probably hate to admit that you don't know. Again, this is something that foreigners know and can use to their advantage. You don't have to answer every question. You're perfectly entitled to say, "That's privileged information at this stage," or simply tell them that you don't know or are not permitted to release the information they seek. Not every question deserves an answer. 9, you probably feel obligated if they give you a gift. You will often be overwhelmed with hospitality and gifts by the foreigners with whom you'll be negotiating. This is an overt attempt to win your favor, and you must deal with it. Rather than giving offense by refusing their favors, the best plan is to reciprocate, which eliminates the personal obligation that may have been created. If they take you out to dinner, you should take them to an equally expensive place. It eliminates the obligation, and you have twice the fun. Finally, permit me to do a little flag waving here. People around the world still admire and respect Americans, and particularly American business people. They trust us and see us as straightforward in our business dealings. So please don't feel that I've been pointing out the shortcomings of Americans when we deal with foreigners. I've been teaching you only how Americans are misperceived by foreign negotiators. Fair enough? Now I want to teach you about negotiating drives. Many different things may be driving the buyer as he or she negotiates with you. You probably don't think much about it, what is driving the buyer, because you tend to assume that what drives the buyer is the same thing that drives you, which is getting the best deal. Sociologists call this sociocentrism, meaning that you tend to feel that the buyer wants what you would want if you were them. Power negotiators know that what we would want if we were them may have nothing to do with what the buyer really wants. Power negotiators know that the better we can understand what is driving the buyer, what the buyer really wants to accomplish, the better we can fulfill the buyer's needs without taking away from our position. Poor negotiators get into trouble because they fear that they will be vulnerable to the buyer's tricks if they let the buyer know too much about them. Instead of wanting to find out what is driving the buyer and revealing his drives to the buyer, the poor negotiator lets his fears stop him from being that open. Let's take a look at the different things that drive the buyer when he's negotiating with you. Recognizing and understanding these drives is a major key to win-win negotiating. The competitive drive is the drive that salespeople know best, and it's why they see negotiating as being so challenging. If you assume that the buyer is out to beat you by any means within the rules of the game, of course you will fear meeting a buyer who might be a better negotiator than you, or someone who is more ruthless than you. The competitive drive certainly exists at many used car lots. The used car dealer attracts customers by offering the lowest prices in town, but pays its salespeople based on the amount of profit they can build into the sale. It's a gladiatorial approach to negotiating. The customer wants to buy for the lowest price, even if the dealer loses money, and the salesperson loses his commission. And the salesperson wants to drive the price up because that's the only way he can make any money. Sound the trumpets, let the spectacle begin, and may the best person win. Competitive drive negotiators believe that you should find out all you can about the buyer, but let the buyer know nothing about you. Knowledge is power, but competitive drive negotiators believe that because of this, the more you find out and the less you reveal, the better off you'll be. When gathering information, the competitive drive negotiator distrusts anything the buyer might tell him because it may be a trick. He gathers information covertly by approaching the other employees at the buyer's company. Since he assumes that the buyer is doing the same to him, he works assiduously to prevent the leaking of information from his side. What's causing this approach is the assumption that there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. What's missing is the possibility that both sides could win because they're not out for exactly the same thing. And by knowing more about the buyer, you can concede issues that are important to the buyer, but may not be significant to you. The solutional drive is the best negotiating situation and the one we all enjoy. This is when the buyer is eager to find a solution and is willing to calmly discuss with you the best way to do that. It means that both sides will negotiate in good faith to find a win-win solution. Solutional drive negotiators tend to be wide open to creative solutions because they feel that there must be a better solution out there somewhere that hasn't occurred to them yet. It takes an open mind to be creative. The great thing about negotiating with someone who is in the solutional drive is that they have cast nothing in stone. They are not restricted by company policy or tradition. They feel that everything is negotiable because everything was at one time negotiated. Short of breaking the law or their personal principles, they will listen to any suggestion you care to propose because they do not see you as in competition with them. It sounds like the perfect solution, doesn't it? Both sides cooperating to find the perfect and fair solution. However, there is one caveat. The buyer could be feigning when they appear to be in the solutional drive. Once you put your cards on the table and told him exactly what you're prepared to do, they may revert to competitive drive negotiating. So if it seems too good to be true, be wary. The personal drive. You may encounter situations where the buyer's main drive is not to win for winning's sake or to find the perfect solution. His main drive may be for his personal profit or aggrandizement. A case that quickly comes to mind is that of an attorney who is working on a fee basis rather than a contingency basis. The attorney would make more money if it took a long time to find a solution. True, it might be a better solution, but the improvement may not be worth as much as the extra fees, so that you're the one who has to balance your solutional drive with your attorney's personal drive. When you run into this, you should see what you can do to satisfy the attorney's personal needs for more fees. It may be the promise of more business in the future if he can wrap it up quickly, or you may have to revert to a competitive drive if the attorney is being difficult. If you feel that he's reluctant to support what you feel is a reasonable compromise, it may be in your best interest to threaten to take your solution over the attorney's head to his client. He won't appreciate that, of course, but if he feels that his client would accept the compromise if you went over his head, you may force him to accept your solution. Another example of personal drive would be a union negotiator who wants to look good to his members. In that case, it may be in both your best interest to make an outrageous initial demand. Then he can go back to his members and say, "So I wasn't able to get you everything you wanted, but just listen to their opening negotiating position. I was able to get them all the way down from that for you." If you had made a more modest opening negotiating position, it might have been difficult for him to sell it to his members because they didn't feel their union fought hard enough for them. Another example of personal drive would be a young buyer who wants to look good to his company. He may have scheduled an inspection tour of your assembly plant that has cost his company a great deal of time and money. So the last thing he wants to do is go back empty-handed without a signed contract. So if your drive is competitive, your best strategy might be to establish that he has a time deadline and stall the negotiations until the last moment. You might be able to reach a terrific settlement in the limousine on the way to the airport if he'd rather agree to anything than go home empty-handed. The organizational drive. You may find yourself in a situation where the buyer seems to have a fine solutional drive. She really wants to find the best solution. But the problem is that it has to be a solution that she can sell to her organization. Because of this, her drive has to be organizational. Even if she found the perfect solution, could she sell it to her people? This happens a great deal in Congress, where the senator or congressperson is eager for a sensible compromise, but knows that he would get ravaged by the voters in his state or district. In close votes, you'll see this all the time. On both sides of the House, the politicians who have the support of their voters will commit quickly. Those who will be in trouble back home may want to support their party, but are reluctant to toe the line. So the party leadership counts noses to see how many votes they need to win by one vote. Then they let their members who would be the most hurt by voting for the bill vote no. The ones who would be hurt least are led like lambs to slaughter, it always seems to me, and made to vote for the bill. If you sell to the government, you run into the organizational drive all the time because the buyer has to conform to the mechanics of the bid process. He may much prefer your proposal, but is obligated by the system to accept an inferior proposal from your competitor because they met the requirements of the bid and came in with a slightly lower price. The better you understand his system and how the bids are written and how you can influence the writing of the bids, the more you'll be able to work with his organizational drive. When you're negotiating with a buyer who must please his organization, he may be reluctant to lay out his problem for you because it would seem too much like collusion. So you need to be thinking, who could be giving the buyer heartburn over this one? Is it their stockholders, their legal department, or perhaps government regulations that they would have to circumvent to implement the best solution? If you understand his problem, you may be able to do things to make the solution more palatable to his organization. For example, you may take a more radical position with the other people at his company than you do at the negotiating table. In this way, your compromise gives the appearance of making major concessions. A company hired me once to help them when their assembly workers' union went on strike. The union negotiators felt that the solution that they had negotiated was reasonable, but they couldn't sell it to their members who were out for blood. We arranged for a local newspaper to interview the president of the company. During the interview, he expressed sincere regrets that he was caught between a rock and a hard place. The union couldn't sell the plan to its members, and the president couldn't sell anything better to his board of directors and stockholders. It appeared that the strike would soon force him to move production from that factory to their assembly plant in Mexico. The next day, the workers' spouses opened up the newspaper to read headlines that said, "Plant to close, jobs going south." By the afternoon of that day, the spouses had put enough pressure on the workers that they clamored to accept the deal that they had previously turned down. If you're dealing with a buyer who has to sell the plan to his organization, you should always be looking for ways to make it easier for him to do that. The attitudinal drive negotiator believes that if both sides like each other enough, they can resolve their differences. The attitudinal drive negotiator would never try to resolve a problem by telephone or through an intermediary. They always want to be face-to-face with the other person so that they can get a feel for who that person is, believing that if we know each other well enough, we can find a solution. Former President Jimmy Carter is very much an attitudinal negotiator. He initiated contact with the North Koreans when they were refusing to back down on their nuclear weapons program. He met with Haitian General Cedras right up to the brink of war and pleaded with President Clinton for just a few more minutes to reason with the general. When he finally reached a settlement, he actually invited that bloodthirsty dictator to come to his church in Plains, Georgia, to teach a Sunday school class. The problem with that kind of negotiating is that it can easily lead to appeasement of the buyer. The attitudinal drive negotiator is so eager to find good in the buyer that he can readily be deceived. Certainly it helps that the buyer and you like each other, because it's hard to find a win-win solution without that. The problem is that this is a two-way street. At the same time that you're working to have the buyer like you, the buyer is working to have you like him. If you both like each other so much, you're just as likely to make concessions to him as he is to you. Power negotiators know that something is far more important than having the buyer like you. You must create a solution that is in both sides' best interests. Then it's mutually beneficial for you both to support the buying arrangement and see that it flourishes. So in this session, I've taught you how the way Americans negotiate is very different from the way other nationalities negotiate. Then I taught you how to analyze the force that's driving the other side in a negotiation. Knowing that is the key to win-win negotiation. In our next session, I'll teach you the characteristics of a power negotiator. You've probably heard the expression, he's a born negotiator, or she's a born negotiator. I don't think that could be true, do you? Read the birth announcements in your local newspaper. You'll never read, at St. Bartholomew's yesterday, a negotiator was born. No, it's a learned skill. And when we meet again, I'll teach you the things that make you a power negotiator. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power. This is Roger Dawson. Welcome back to the 8th in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last session together, I taught you that the way Americans negotiate is very different from the way other nationalities negotiate. Then I taught you how to analyze the force that's driving the buyer in a negotiation. Knowing that is the key to win-win negotiation. In this session, I'll teach you the characteristics of a power negotiator. You've probably heard the expression, oh, he's a born negotiator, or she's a born negotiator. I don't think that could be true, do you? Read the birth announcements in your local newspaper. You'll never read, at St. Bartholomew's yesterday, a negotiator was born. No, it's a learned skill, just like everything else. These are the characteristics of a power negotiator. Let's start with the personal characteristics of a power negotiator. To be a power negotiator, you need to have or develop these personal characteristics: the courage to probe for more information, the patience to outlast the other negotiator, the courage to ask for more than you expect to get, the integrity to press for win-win solutions, and the willingness to be a good listener. Let's take a look at each of these. First, the courage to probe for more information. Poor negotiators are always reluctant to question anything the other says, so they negotiate knowing only what the other side has chosen to tell them. Power negotiators are constantly challenging what they know about the other side, and what's more important, the assumptions that they have made based on that knowledge. You should adopt many of the approaches of investigative reporters as you gather information. Ask the tough questions, the ones that you feel sure they won't answer. Even if they don't answer, you'll be learning by judging their reaction to being asked. Ask the same question of